After years of working my ass off, I'm finally here, sitting on the porch of a small, sun-drenched cottage overlooking a sparkling lake. The air is so still I can hear the buzz of insects nearby, the gentle rustle of leaves, and my own quiet breathing. For the first time in my life, everything around me feels quiet, peaceful. But that peace? It's tinged with a bitterness I can't fully shake. I shouldn't have had to come here alone. The whole point of working myself to the bone was to provide for my family. To build this life and, one day, retire here with the people I thought I was doing it all for. Instead, I'm here alone, and back at home, my wife and 2 grown kids are furious that I've stopped funneling money into the household account. But here's the thing, each of them is an adult, with a full-time job and no debts beyond the basics. My wife went back to work full-time when our youngest was 7. He's 24 now, his sister is 27, and yet, somehow, I'm still the one expected to handle every single bill, buy every damn loaf of bread, pay every utility, cover every expense like they're still little kids with no income. It's been years of this, and I've grown tired, so damn tired, of the routine. I worked away from home on a rotating schedule, often days, sometimes weeks, at a time. I'd come home, drained and ready for just a few comforts, food in the fridge, a quiet place to unwind. That's all I wanted. I was giving them everything else, full financial support, free housing, cars, vacations, anything to make their lives easier. But when I came home 2 months ago, something in me snapped. After another long stint away, I got back and immediately noticed the usual request I made, the simplest one, hadn't been met. No loaf of sourdough, no meat or cheese, no condiments. Nothing I could grab to make myself a sandwich without heading straight to the store. And mind you, I'm not asking for anything fancy here. It's just basic stuff, a few things I can count on being there so that after hours of travel and work, I have something to eat. I went looking for my wife, frustrated but hoping there was some kind of explanation. But when I found her, she looked at me like I was out of my mind for caring about something as small as groceries. I thought you'd just pick it up yourself, she shrugged, not looking up from her phone. Something broke inside me then. All these years, I've been carrying the load without complaint. I've been paying every bill, covering every cost, and they couldn't even be bothered to spend a few dollars on the food I specifically requested, the food that'd make it clear someone here had thought about me for a change. When I brought it up, when I finally pushed back, my kids jumped in. They told me I was being ridiculous, that life is expensive, and things are tough all around. All 3 of them piled on, making it sound like I was the unreasonable one. I didn't know what to say. How could they sit there, 3 grown adults with incomes, enjoying a life where every big expense is already taken care of for them, and tell me I was out of line? I could feel something shift in me. The anger, the frustration, the feeling of being taken for granted, it was all building up like a dam about to burst. I took a deep breath and reminded them of something we discussed years ago, that when they started working full-time, they'd begin contributing to the household budget. We agreed they'd pay for a portion of the utilities and food, at least to lighten the load a bit. It wasn't supposed to be a forever arrangement where I foot the bill for 3 able-bodied adults who have perfectly good jobs. But they just laughed it off, acting as if that old agreement was some joke. We're barely making ends meet as it is, they said, as though their version of barely was anywhere near what most people would consider a struggle. They didn't have rent, they didn't have mortgages, they didn't even have student loans. All they had to do was cover their day-to-day expenses, and they still couldn't manage that? In that moment, I knew I'd had enough. It was like a weight was lifted and dropped at the same time. I didn't argue any further. Instead, I told them that I'd made up my mind. I would be going to our retirement property overseas, and they would be handling the finances themselves for once. I planned to stay there for my next rotation break and would let them take care of the food, utilities, property taxes, and everything else. I wouldn't deposit another dime into that budget account. When the time came, I did just that. After wrapping up work, I stayed overnight in a hotel, skipped my usual trip home, and flew straight to the property we'd bought years ago as a retirement dream. The plan had always been to eventually settle there, but I had never imagined it would happen alone. It felt strange at first, liberating, but strange. I was so used to the noise and demands of home, of people who depended on me constantly, whether they acknowledged it or not. Here, for the first time in decades, it was just me, my thoughts, and the slow rhythm of nature. The silence felt like a balm to my soul. For weeks, I settled into a routine I hadn't experienced in years. I woke up when I wanted, ate when I wanted, and the only person I had to think about was myself. In that stillness, I started to realize just how much I had sacrificed over the years, sacrifices that had become so routine they were invisible, even to me. But back home, the silence didn't last. The messages started pouring in almost immediately. At first, they were polite enough, just updates or questions about the house or where certain things were. But when they realized I hadn't transferred any money into the budget account, the tone shifted quickly. My wife was the first to break. "What are we supposed to do now? You didn't leave us with any money," she texted, followed by a string of exclamation points that told me she was more than a little angry. It wasn't long before my son and daughter chimed in with similar complaints, piling on one after another. They kept telling me how unfair it was that I'd just up and left, how irresponsible it was to expect them to pay for everything. The irony wasn't lost on me. At first, I didn't respond. I wanted them to sit with the reality of their situation, to feel even a fraction of the pressure I'd been carrying for years. But the messages kept coming, filling my phone with accusations, guilt trips, and pleas. They all had the same undertone: disbelief that I would actually follow through with my decision. After a week, I decided to respond, mostly to set the record straight. I wrote back, short and to the point. "I've been paying for everything for years. The house, cars, food, and bills, all of it. You're 3 adults with full-time jobs, and I think it's time you learn to manage on your own. I'll be back when my next rotation starts, but until then, it's on you to cover the costs." There was a pause in their responses after that. It was like they couldn't believe I'd gone through with it, and honestly, it surprised me a bit, too. I'd spent so many years saying yes and opening my wallet, even when it meant sacrificing my own wants and needs, that I don't think any of us thought I'd ever say no. But here I was, sticking to my guns for the first time in ages. And every day, as I looked out over the water, as I fixed myself a quiet dinner, as I took long walks without a single demand or complaint in my ear, I felt something growing inside me: peace. It was a peace born from knowing I'd finally drawn a line. And I was determined not to let them pull me back across it. First update. A few weeks passed, and by then, I was beginning to hear more from friends and extended family about what was going on back home. Apparently, the strain was hitting them harder than they'd expected. At first, I'd heard my wife and kids try to keep up appearances. They continued spending as they always had, eating out, ordering delivery, shopping as if nothing had changed. But when the bills started piling up and the bank account started to dwindle, they were forced to adjust. They began calling friends and relatives for advice, though I doubt they were fully transparent about why they suddenly needed help budgeting. My sister called me one evening to check in, and, though she tried to be subtle, it was clear she'd been talking to my wife. "Do you really think this is the best way to handle things?" she asked, her voice filled with that older sibling concern that's never fully left her tone, no matter how old we've gotten. "I'm just giving them the chance to step up," I replied. "They're all working, they've got a roof over their heads, and they don't have to worry about rent or a mortgage. They're more fortunate than most, and it's time they see that." She sighed but didn't press further. Even though she didn't fully agree, I could tell she understood where I was coming from. After all, she'd seen me take on the burden of supporting the family for years without a word of complaint. Meanwhile, my wife was making it abundantly clear in her messages that this wasn't sitting well with her. The texts I'd initially ignored were now laced with frustration and sometimes even panic. She said things like, "I don't understand why you do this now, out of nowhere, and this isn't fair to the kids, they're still figuring things out." I tried to be patient, explaining as calmly as I could that I hadn't done this out of nowhere. I'd been asking for years, waiting for years, giving them every opportunity to start contributing. And every time, they'd brushed it off, acted like it was a joke, like I'd never actually enforce it. The more they complained, the more it cemented my decision. If they had been using the money I provided for essentials and carefully budgeting, I might have felt differently. But knowing how freely they'd spent on luxuries and how little they'd saved only added to my resolve. I wanted them to experience the real world, where every meal out and every streaming subscription adds up. Second update. A month had passed, and I'd settled fully into my routine overseas. I had a small garden, a quiet reading nook, and plenty of time to reflect on what this next chapter of my life might look like. Meanwhile, back home, things were finally starting to change. From what I could gather from the sporadic texts my wife now sent, she and the kids were beginning to make real adjustments. They'd cut back on takeout and had started cooking at home. They'd canceled a few subscriptions and were actually dividing up household chores instead of expecting everything to magically get done. One evening, I got a text from my daughter that surprised me. She was usually the quietest when it came to family finances, preferring to stay out of the arguments. But this time, she reached out directly. "Hey, Dad. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much you were handling. We're trying to figure things out now, but it's been a lot harder than I thought." I stared at that message for a long time, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that maybe, finally, they were starting to understand. Sadness that it had taken such a drastic step for them to see the sacrifices I'd been making. I replied simply, I appreciate that. I hope you're all learning what it takes to keep things running. It's a lot, but it's something I know you're all capable of. My wife's texts, meanwhile, had softened. She wasn't exactly apologetic, but I could tell she was seeing things differently. Her complaints had given way to questions about budgeting, small details on how to lower utility costs, and even grocery list tips. It was as though, for the first time, she was seeing how much went into running a household, things I'd been handling alone for years. Final update. Eventually, my next work rotation came around, and it was time for me to return to the States. I decided to book a room at a hotel nearby for my first few days back, just to give myself some breathing room to see how things felt. The family knew I'd be returning, but I was clear that I wouldn't be immediately coming home. The day after I landed, my wife called and asked if we could talk in person. I agreed, and when we met, she looked different, less defensive, more thoughtful. She started with a quiet apology, something I hadn't expected. You were right, she admitted, not meeting my eyes. I didn't realize how much work went into everything, how much you were handling on your own. I guess I just got used to you taking care of it all, and I didn't stop to think. Her voice was softer, and she seemed genuinely remorseful. She explained that the last few months had been hard on all of them. They'd argued, struggled, and even resented each other for things they'd never thought about before. But they'd also learned a lot. My son and daughter both wanted to sit down and talk as well. They seemed embarrassed, humbled in a way that only experience could teach. They admitted they had taken things for granted and that the reality of expenses, budgeting, and simply managing a household had been a rude awakening. We talked for a long time, and by the end, we reached a new agreement. They'd all contribute to the household budget moving forward, not a huge amount, but enough to keep them engaged and responsible. I'd resume some support, but with clear boundaries and expectations that they'd respect. I returned home, feeling a renewed sense of balance. They finally understood what it took to keep everything running, and I no longer felt the weight of doing it all alone. For the first time, I felt like we were a family in every sense, sharing responsibilities and truly appreciating each other's efforts. And though the journey to get here had been rocky, it was worth every step.